Hello, we're continuing our series through Daniel, the first 6 chapters of Daniel. We're up to Daniel 4, and you may remember we've talked about the exile, Daniel and his friends being taken to Babylon. We've talked about the fact he interpreted one of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. We've had the story of the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego last week, and now we move on to chapter 4, which is kind of almost a self-contained story. I'm going to read the first 9 chapters of chapter 4, first 9 verses, sorry. King Nebuchadnezzar. So it's important to notice that this chapter, so I was going to start reading. I'm going to explain before I start reading. This chapter is written from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view. Before it's kind of been a narrator, but now we're hearing this story from Nebuchadnezzar's own pen. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in my bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence and I told him the dream. He is called Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. So, just to set the scene, we've got Nebuchadnezzar who has a dream that terrifies him. If this sounds familiar, it's because we've had this before in chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He doesn't know what it means. He summons the wise men and astrologers to interpret it, and none of them can help him. And eventually Daniel comes along and can interpret it. It's a bit different to chapter 2. For one thing, he actually tells people what the dream is this time. In Daniel 2, he says, you tell me what the dream is and the interpretation so that I know you're really wise men and magicians and so on. This time he tells them the dream, but they can't interpret it. And finally, I don't know why Daniel wasn't the first person brought in, bearing in mind what happened in chapter 2, but, for dramatic effect, finally Daniel comes in to the court, and Nebuchadnezzar must think, here's the guy who can do this. Now the dream, I'm not going to read the passage, it's quite a straightforward dream. It's a dream of a tree, a magnificent tree that's so beautiful and large that all the birds and animals are able to shelter in it. And then a voice comes from heaven and says, cut this tree down and cover its stump in bronze and iron. It is bronze and iron, just had to check. Bronze and iron. And then the voice says, let him live like an animal for 7 times. Let him eat grass and so on. So it's a straightforward dream, especially in a way compared to the dream of the statue Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2. It's this tree that gets chopped down, the stump gets covered in bronze and iron, and then whoever this is, or the tree, is supposed to live like an animal for 7 times. And unlike the last dream we read about in Daniel chapter 2, the meaning of this one is fairly clear and explicit. Let me read from, so Daniel hears the dream, and this is what he says to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, this is my interpretation, O king, reading from verse 24. And this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. So Daniel has already explained that the tree in the dream is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the tree, a great and prosperous and mighty empire that shelters all the nations around it, but is going to be chopped chopped down. He says, you will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High King is sovereign over the kingdom of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge the heaven rules. Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. And unlike the last dream in chapter 2, which speaks of future empires, this one is played out to its conclusion, picking up from verse 28. So we finished at verse 27, so carrying on straight from verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is not this great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken away from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of man and gives them to anyone he wishes." Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heavens until his hair grew like feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. So there's some imagery for you. So it's quite a momentous thing, you would think. A king, an emperor, king of a mighty empire, spending 7 times, or a lot of Bibles translate it 7 years. It's assumed it's 7 years, but it can be translated 7 times. Driven out, living like an animal, with his hair growing and his nails growing. It seems like a momentous occasion. Nebuchadnezzar is a major historical figure. The Babylonian Empire is a major historical event, and we have quite a lot of information about Nebuchadnezzar and about Babylon from this time. So the obvious question is, this seems like something that should be recorded somewhere, right? This seems like something that historians should have found evidence of. It's quite an immense thing. So the question is, do we have a sort of historical documents or archaeological evidence or anything that shows that King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylon spent 7 times, however long that is, 7 years, a period of his life where he was driven out of his kingdom and lived like a madman in the fields around him? Do we have any record of that? And I'm afraid to tell you that we do not. We do not have anything that sort of confirms that this event actually happened. But when you begin to look into it, well, it's interesting, but it's also a bit complicated. Some scholars make the point, most scholars I think make the point, is we have no record of this in the history of Nebuchadnezzar, and neither should we expect to, because everything we have recorded about Nebuchadnezzar is uniformly positive. What a great king he is. This is what he achieved. These are the wars he won. It just didn't happen. You just didn't write down and record anything, especially for a king like Nebuchadnezzar, that was going to embarrass him. You didn't record anything that made him look anything less than awesome and amazing. So many scholars say, so we shouldn't expect to find any record of this event. And other scholars say, yeah, we don't have any record of this, but you know what we do have? We have periods in Nebuchadnezzar's life where there is not much recorded, where nothing much happens. And it's possible that this event happened during one of these. Like, well, we can't write that Nebuchadnezzar went insane for a while, so let's just write nothing. Let's just sweep it under the carpet and keep silence. The question is, do we have a 7-year period of silence? Well, again, some scholars say, well, yes, we do. And some scholars say, no, we don't. We have periods of silence, but nothing that is for 7 years. So again, no straight answer, no no simple explanation there. But something else I discovered that I did find very interesting is we do have a record of a Babylonian king, Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who did kind of have a breakdown and did get kicked, sort of temporarily removed from power, and did sort of live in exile for a while. It's not Nebuchadnezzar, but it's Nabonidus. And some scholars have said, yeah, this is the story. It's just they've changed the name for whatever reason. And some of the names in the book of Daniel are a bit interesting and unusual. So they, it's just the wrong name. It's not King Nebuchadnezzar. At least it's not the King Nebuchadnezzar we've had up till now. It's a different king who just was maybe called Nebuchadnezzar as well by some people, but it's King Nabonidus. And what's interesting is that amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, they did find a document that's not part of the Bible, but is part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, recording the story of Nabonidus, saying he did go crazy for a while, but he was eventually restored to his right mind when a Jewish exile in his court instructed him to write a declaration of praise to the Most High God. And so some scholars say, well, there you go. That's the story. It's not just the names are muddled up. So, and it would kind of make sense in some ways if it was a different king to the Nebuchadnezzar who's already had a dream sort of interpreted and already had things happen. But maybe it is the same Nebuchadnezzar, because as you can probably tell, it's not conclusive. It would be nice if everything fell into place and, there was a direct historical document that backed up this story, but we don't have that. It's interesting, but it's inconclusive, which is what life is like, really, isn't it? Interesting, but inconclusive, complicated. And biblical studies is the same thing, complicated. Now, I've done a lot of study over the years, and I've thought about a lot of things. I've read a lot of books, listened to a lot of lectures, and thought and processed and pondered and written essays on some very complicated things over the years. But what I have realized over the years is that although some of the things we look into can be very complicated, and a lot of them have been very profitable for me, what I have realized over the years is actually my relationship with God, my day-to-day relationship with God, is really pretty simple. It's not complicated at all. At least it doesn't need to be complicated. I have sometimes complicated it, but I think from God's perspective, what God wants is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. One of the theologians I've read and listened to lectures about during my first degree was a guy called Karl Barth, who was a Swiss-German theologian, lived sort of in the 20th century, early to mid-late 20th century, who was an incredibly influential theologian, probably the most influential sort of certainly Reformed theologian or neo-Reformed theologian of the generation of the 20th century. And he wrote some incredibly complicated things, and they were in German as well, so that's like 3 times as complicated. And some very thick books, and thought about lots of different aspects of systematic theology and taught on it and wrote about it. But he was once asked by an interviewer, he was once asked, what is, in all your studies, all the books you've written, what's the most profound and important truth that you've discovered in all of your studies? And do you know what he replied? His reply was this. The most profound and important truth he discovered, his reply was, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. That was, as far as Karl Barth is concerned, the most profound and important truth he discovered in all of his studies. And that's simple, isn't it? It's words from a children's song, but that is the heart of the gospel. And the most important thing that the gospel declares, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Daniel seems like quite a complicated book, certainly when you get into the visions and the dreams, some of which we've had, and there's more coming, especially in the later part of the book. But really, I don't know that Daniel is a particularly complicated book, or if it's supposed to be a complicated book. The vision of Daniel 2 that Ronnie spoke on about the statue and the different layers, it's complicated. Like Ronnie brought up a slide with what the different layers could mean, and he mentioned the different discussions he'd found and opinions. But he said at the beginning of his sermon what the message was really: God is in charge. That's quite a simple message, isn't it? However complicated the dream is, the point of the dream was to say God is in charge. And here, the dream may seem complicated and mysterious, but the message of the dream is quite simple. The message of this chapter is quite straightforward. So Nebuchadnezzar is sort of living like a wild animal, and eventually we're told in the story that he realizes his arrogance and his pride. He humbles himself before God, acknowledges that it is God who gave him his kingdom and his empire and all the peoples he conquered. Actually, it was God who gave them into his hand, and he is restored to his right mind and restored to his kingdom, and has a happy rest of his reign. But the very last verse, got a problem with chapters and verses today. Very last verse of chapter 4 is this: "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." And that's the message of this chapter. That's the message of the dream. That's the message of this whole process. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. And we gather from the end of the chapter that he's learned this lesson that God wanted to teach him. And if you remember at the beginning of the verses, he opens by offering this declaration of praise to God. It sounds almost like a psalm, Is Nebuchadnezzar, and I was kind of raised a similar question when he was looked at last week at chapter 3. So is Nebuchadnezzar, is he a convert to Judaism now? Is he a follower of God? He's certainly writing like a psalm. He's writing like a follower of God. But notice how Nebuchadnezzar tells this story. Okay, we at the beginning of the story, he offers up this declaration of praise and he begins to explain what happened to him. But notice the kind of language he uses. He says, "Oh, and then Daniel came," and he says, Daniel, he's also called Belteshazzar, named after my God. So, okay, acknowledges the great and just of the Most High, that the Most High is able to humble those who are proud. But he's still kind of saying, "Oh yeah, but Belteshazzar, he's my God. This is what I'm familiar with." When he explains where Daniel's gift comes from, now his ability to interpret dreams. In chapter 1, we read, God gave him this ability. In chapter 2, he actually says to Nebuchadnezzar, if it's the same Nebuchadnezzar, he says to him, no one can do what you're asking. No one can interpret dreams. No one can know this, but God can. And God will reveal this. So Daniel has been very clear. My gift comes from God. But notice Nebuchadnezzar, as he goes on, he says, Daniel, named Belteshazzar after my God, and he is filled with the spirit of the holy gods. So from Nebuchadnezzar's understanding of Daniel's gift, it's because Daniel's filled with the spirit of the holy gods, whatever that means. And notice again, when Daniel comes into his presence, he says, Daniel, chief of the magicians. So Daniel's abilities had seen him promoted within this Babylonian hierarchy, but it's still, Daniel, is magic. What you do is magic, and you are filled with the spirit of the holy gods. That's how you do this. Even though Daniel has said, even though chapter 1 has said, no, it's God who does this. Nebuchadnezzar is still sort of, even having had this experience, he's still talking about, so Daniel, he's the chief of magicians. He does what he does because he's filled with the spirit of the holy gods. So although Nebuchadnezzar seems to have learned this lesson about his pride, he's not perfect. He doesn't understand everything. He still kind of sees the world through his Babylonian worldview of magic and gods and God Bel being his god. But in a way, that doesn't matter, because as we heard, the point of this, God's agenda, was to humble Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't, right, Nebuchadnezzar, we're going to clarify all your theology, get everything sorted in your head. The message was, Nebuchadnezzar, you need to learn humility. And that's what we're going to do. You don't need to understand everything. You don't need to have everything sorted in order for God to work in your life, or in order to God to develop a relationship with you. There can still be parts of your life that are a mess, parts of your thinking that are not right, and God will still work with you. God will still work in your life. My relationship with God, as I said, I think is quite simple. He made me, he loves me, he wants a relationship with me, he sent Jesus to make that happen. It's quite simple. And in the way it works day to day, I can make it complicated. Think God is concerned with a billion different things that actually I'm concerned with, and he's not. But I really believe God keeps things simple. God will say, right, let's do one thing at a time. So like Nebuchadnezzar, he's got all this messed up thinking, but God says, no, his biggest problem is his pride. He doesn't realize that it is me who's given him all this success. So that's what we're going to work on. And it's a long-term project for God. 7 times, whatever that is, as I said, some translations, 7 years he's in the wilderness. And if it is the same Nebuchadnezzar, Oz mentioned the sort of pride of building that golden column, a golden pillar in chapter 3, that pride is obviously something that's been going on for ages, but God takes a long-term view. We're going to take years, but we are going to fix this problem of pride. And I think God looks at me and he says, right, what is the biggest problem in James's life? What's the biggest block, the thing that's hindering his relationship with me the most? What is that? Not what is James most concerned about? What is James most stressed about? What does James think the biggest problem is? What is the biggest issue in my relationship with James? The biggest thing that's stopping him from trusting me? The biggest thing that's stopping him from loving me more? That is what we're going to work on. That's the thing I'm going to focus on. Regardless of what James thinks the biggest problem is, I know, and we're going to work on that. Now, I'm in a rush. I want to fix everything that's wrong in my life tomorrow. I want to fix everything that's wrong in your life. I'm very aware of all the things that you do wrong. Let me tell you that. And I want to fix those as well. But God is patient, and God is gracious, and God is gentle in how he deals with us. And I think one aspect of his grace, one aspect of his gentleness, is that he does not take the attitude of, right, we're going to fix everything. You've got a long list of things wrong here. We're going to fix everything. God's attitude is, right, what's the biggest problem? Let's deal with that first. However long it takes, and we won't worry about all the other things. We'll just do one thing at a time. And I think that's an aspect of God's gentleness and his grace and his patience in dealing with us. So what I want to say to you this morning is relax. Just relax, okay? My advice to you this morning is let God set the agenda. Let God set your agenda for how your life should change. You may remember the story of Mary and Martha in Luke's Gospel, where Jesus goes to their house for dinner, and Martha is being a good host and sorting out all the cleaning and preparing the food. But Mary, her sister, is sitting at Jesus' feet listening to Jesus teach. And Martha has had enough and says to Jesus, tell my sister to help me. And do you remember what Jesus' response to Martha is? It's, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing matters. Mary has chosen what is best, and it will not be taken away from her. Only one thing matters. And I really believe that in our day-to-day walk with God, God takes that same attitude. Of course he does, because this is Jesus who's saying this. One thing matters. God is not determined to fix everything all at once. One thing matters. Just focus on your relationship with him and let him set the agenda. You might say, you know what, God, I think we need to go to Manchester. This is a metaphor, by the way, before anyone thinks I'm telling you, me and God get in the car and drive places together. I feel like we need to go to Manchester, God, and we need to go down to Cornwall, and I've got some business in Slough, and we've got all these, and maybe I'm thinking, what's the best, most direct way to hit all these places in the minimum amount of time? But God says, James, stop. We're going to Cardiff. That's where we're going. Okay, that's the most important destination. And put thoughts of Manchester and Slough and Cornwall out of your mind. We'll get to those places eventually, but we are going to Cardiff, and that's the only place we're going. So let's just think about the traffic on the M4. Let's not worry about traffic and roadworks in other parts of the country. Let's just focus on that one thing. Simplify your relationship with God. Don't make it any more complicated than it needs to be. I think, as I said, this is part of God's grace to us, that there is no pressure from him for you to be perfect, for you to fix all your faults in one day or 1 week or 1 month. God spent 7 years here at least trying to undo Nebuchadnezzar's pride, or 7 times. But it's a long-term project. There's no pressure from him to fix all of your faults in 1 day or 1 week or 1 month. That pressure comes from you or from people around you. So relax, let God set the agenda and just go along for the ride. And as you do that, cut others some slack as well. I mentioned sort of tongue in cheek that I know what your problem is, and I know, I want to fix you too. But I think there's truth in that, in me, and I think in all of us. We're aware of others' failings, particularly I think in the issue of religion and theology. We don't notice the irony. God's spent 4 years fixing something in my head, and the moment I click and understand, my immediate response to turn and I say, well, why don't you understand it? I get this. God's taught me this. Why haven't you caught up with me yet? There's a kind of a horrible irony in this. And you might think you know what a person's biggest issue is, what God needs to fix in their life, but maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. Maybe God does. So cut them some slack. Maybe God's decided there's something that's more important for him to deal with, that they're dealing with at the moment. Maybe something you haven't even realized yet. And remember the message of Daniel chapter 4, the closing chapter. Verse 37, those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. This is a warning. This is a warning to us too. It's interesting that after Daniel interprets the dream, what does he say to Nebuchadnezzar in verse 27? He pleads with Nebuchadnezzar, please repent, change your ways, and maybe this won't happen. Maybe your prosperity will continue. Humble yourself, or God will do it. That's the sort of what happens here in chapter 4. And this is, I think, something that God does say to us. Humble yourself or I'll do it. And it's a lesson we need to learn. Not just to give grace to ourselves, but let's not let pride steal grace from others. The truth of the matter is I don't know. I don't actually know you. I don't know who's watching this. I don't know, if I'll ever meet you or ever know you. And if I do, maybe I don't know you very well, but that doesn't matter. I don't know what God knows. I will put that on film. I don't know what God knows. What's the biggest block in your relationship with God? I don't know. But God does. But God does. What is it that's making it hardest for you to draw near to him, to become more like Jesus? You may not know, but God does. And you might think, oh, I do know, it's this thing here. But maybe God's saying, no, forget that. Don't worry about that right now. This is the real issue. This is the thing we need to work on. So let God set the agenda for yourself and others, and be like Daniel. Be like Daniel, who doesn't come to Nebuchadnezzar, and when Nebuchadnezzar says, "Oh, Daniel, you're filled with the spirit of the holy gods, my chief of magicians," Daniel doesn't immediately say, "No, can I just stop you there? Let's sort out your thinking. I've already explained at least once that it's God." Daniel doesn't do that. Daniel just senses that God is doing something else and goes along with that. So ask God where you should be heading. Ask God what you should be looking at, and just travel with him on that journey.